QSO Today, episode 463, Thomas Langer, KD9FPC. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes pages or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. This is the best way to show your support and receive QSO Today Academy membership at the same time. Tickets are on sale now on the QSO Today Academy website at qsotodayhamexpo.com. Tickets are $15 and will give you access to the QSO Today Academy event on September 9th and 10th, 2023, and the 30-day period following. Please get your ticket today. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. The QSO Today Academy event appears the weekend of September 9th and 10th, 2023. The Academy replaces our QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo that has run its course. The Academy, while having 2 live events per year, will also have all of the resources of a virtual ham radio school going forward. We already have some excellent presentations on the Academy website that will be featured at the Academy event. Thomas Langer, KD9FPC, grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. As a child, he was introduced to his father's amateur radio and developed a passion for electronics and radio. Years later, after a successful entrepreneurial career, and only after facing a major health issue which changed the course of his life, that Tom fully embraced amateur radio. Tom believes that this hobby is not only mentally stimulating, but also serves as a way to connect with others, especially when chronic illness often threatens human relationships outside of the immediate family. KD9FPC is my QSO today. KD9FPC, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Tom?
I am.
Tom, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
You bet. It's a long story, but I first wanted to say thanks for having me today. I'm really excited to be here.
So, Thomas, let's start at the very beginning. How did you become interested in technology, radio, and where did that go? Let's start at the very heart of it.
As a young fellow, I was actually born on an Air Force. For those of you that remember it, Smoky Hill Air Force Base, Salina, Kansas, where my father at the time was working with SACS, Strategic Air Command. And he was a huge radio. He just loved ham radio. He loved shortwave. You name it, he was into it. So I guess I grew up in it at his knee while he sat next to the washer in the basement, which the story goes was quite interesting because, of course, my mother was washing diapers in the washer next to where his station was. And so, needless to say, the smell was rather impressive, at least on him.
What was his call sign?
W0ITT, I believe, was this call sign back in that day. But then we came along later, and you moved beyond that. We moved to some different Air Force bases, things like that, eventually ending up in the Milwaukee area. So now this is contemporary to my own memory, was the whip. He didn't have a setup in the house. He was totally mobile. So we had a 1961 Oldsmobile, and it had, all I can say is my mom would have to kind of sit to the far end, which took a lot of doing in a car like that because the thing was the size of a land yacht, but he had so much equipment sitting in the middle that she had to sit far down and right next to the door, pressed up to the door. So it was fun to listen to him. He'd take me out there at night. He'd sit in the car. If we got Canada, that was considered DX, and that was the the time of his life. But starting out, he was working with, when he was indoors, he was working with a military surplus receiver and a Heathkit transmitter on an MFIT. And as we go to different bases, and we always had apartment type style housing, he would just kind of throw the line out the back of the window and hope the wind didn't blow so the people downstairs would see the antenna waving back and forth in front of the window. The one thing I do remember clearly was the night he wasn't sure whether it was transmitting properly, and he wanted to make sure his antenna was okay. So he grabbed that NFET and hit the transmit button, and to this day he lives with a scar in the palm of his hand.
From an RF burn.
From an RF burn.
All of this time, did he encourage you to also get your ham radio license? It seemed to me that was the prime time during the late 60s, early 70s.
Right. Yeah, he did. But I didn't. At that point, I was going into my phase of early 1970s rebellion. So what I did do, however, was through school, I had a teacher by the name of Wally Miner, and he and I would spend numbers of hours together because I helped out in an electronics class that we had at our now used to be called junior high school, now I guess they call it middle school. And so I started learning there and built my first crystal radio. And from there, electronics and things radio were just kind of what I was about. And then along came, getting a job and having to be something. It was pretty interesting. I drove a bus to make money to go to school, and one of the big highway buses. They call them charter coaches, as well as school buses, to make some money. And I, as a result, became a CB guy.
So you became a CB radio operator while driving the bus?
Yes.
Interesting that they'd let you do that.
Well, why? Oh, you mean talk and drive?
Right, with passengers.
Technically speaking, we were only supposed to talk when we didn't have passengers on board. So what we would do is just listen, because there'd be some trucker somewhere reporting the location of somebody that we'd really rather not speed past.
I see. So they were reporting speed zones.
Yeah, they would bear in the middle, bear in the air, whatever. But it was to... And the state patrol, I've talked to a number of state patrolmen, and they know full good and well, obviously, that all goes on. And in fact, they listen to it in order to find out who they really ought to be looking for.
Did the bus company install the CB radios as part of keeping their buses aligned on the road, knowing what the conditions are? So essentially this became a value to you, but it was something that was already in the buses?
No, it was a situation where they didn't take the antennas off the mirror racks, but everybody had their own radio, and you had to plug it in and screw it on the antennas. Now,
as you're going to school, what kind of school did you go to that you were driving the buses to support schooling? Did you stay in electronics?
Not at first. I find people fascinating. So what I got into was in the area of management and working with marketing. Through high school, I had been a member of something called DECA.
Oh, sure, I remember.
Yeah, Distributed Education Club. And we'd have competition. So I was quite involved with that. So it seemed to send me, it seemed to launch me more into a business type career than necessarily in engineering or something of that sort. This is always the hard part. I went full-time for one semester to college, majored in partying and not doing much college. And as a result, ended up doing my degree, which is in management, 10 years part-time while I worked full-time to support. At that point, I'd gotten married, so we needed to support all of that. So I had to go get a real job and then go to school in the evenings and on weekends. So for 10 years, graduated with 160 credits because every year and a half or so I was moving with the job. And so the result being that, well, we can't accept these credits, but we'll accept these credits. So you have to retake that. So that lengthened my college career to 10 years of part-time, evenings and weekends. And then graduated from there. And it was kind of interesting how it all worked out. I graduated from a small college in South Central Michigan because we were living in Toledo at the time. And I wanted to get a master's. I didn't want to stop the flow. I was already going to school for 10 years. I thought, well, might as well just keep right on going. And I did. And ended up at a local or a quasi-local university to do a master's. And I walked in and I said, I'd like an MBA, please. And they said, well, sure, but you have to take these 6 prerequisite courses. And I said, well, let me back up the truck here. I don't want to spend the rest of my life in school, but, do you have a degree that would work with the degree I already have to have no prerequisites? Well, yeah, it's a little bit of an unusual degree, but yes, we do. And I said, fine, I'm signing up for it.
And what was that degree?
Master's in Organizational Development. There were only 3 universities that offered it, and it was a study of how organizations develop, how people get along, how things work together, and methods of measurement, and then coming back to the point where you could help someone in an organization get a better handle on their productivity and on their relationships between employees and things like that. And that was a fascinating program to study, as it turned out. Yeah, it just kind of kept on going.
How did that become a profession for you? What did you end up doing after that?
Well, the reality is I'm referred to by many as a serial entrepreneur.
I know that well.
After 10 years in corporate life, which helped me with my education things, I went back out on my own and I started a business-to-business insurance brokerage. We were then living in Milwaukee, Ohio. I really think to my wife, I said, I really think we need to move to like Chicago. It's a big market, lots to do there, lots of demand for the kinds of things I do. And she being a homegrown Milwaukee girl, and I took her away from home for the first time when we moved to St. Louis, initially in the career. But she said, listen, you can go ahead and go to Chicago. Give me a call in Milwaukee once in a while and let me know what's going on. So it was quite clear that if I was going entrepreneurial, she was going to live in her hometown, which is, as you know, all the crazy names in Wisconsin, Wauwatosa. So in any event, moved back here, started that business. It took 18 months to financially feel like, gee, there's a light at the end of the tunnel, but just kept pounding. My degree, though, and my experience in the corporate world had a lot to do with research, and I love research, and I love learning new things. So we, a couple of years after I got set up with the brokerage, I established a research firm where we did business-to-business research in the world of automotive and off-highway, mining, you name it. We pretty much covered the gamut. And so that turned out great. And so then I had a partnership, 50-50 partnership with a fellow in India, where we did large data analytics. We were the nasty people that were doing data analytics back then for things like credit card companies and others. And so had that business, and then lastly established a holding company, because what I would do is I'd buy small businesses that were in some kind of tough shape, and then within the kind of the circle of where I wanted to be in terms of industries and things. So as an example, we acquired a small employment firm, things like that, and then would bring that over time into part of the brokerage. So yeah, it was quite a ride.
When you say as a serial entrepreneur, you went from one business to the other, you built it up and you sold it, or did you stay in all these businesses. You started one after the other. So you held on to the insurance brokerage business. You went into data analytics. You continued to do that. Is that what you did?
Absolutely. I had all four of them going at the same time.
It's my understanding that you actually finally got licensed much later in your adult life. What were you doing for outside of being an entrepreneur?
Well, nothing. And for all intents and purposes, I was huge into soccer or football, as it would be known elsewhere. And so I'm a nationally licensed soccer coach. So in order to even see my kids, I got involved in the soccer when they were quite young, and eventually ended up coaching some semi-pro soccer later, well into my career. Had a great time with it, but then one day the doctor said, "Your soccer career is now done." That was in 2007, in September, because it turned out that my body didn't like blood platelets, so it killed them. And so he said, "You get whacked in the head with an 80-mile-an-hour soccer ball, we can't be sure we're going to get you back up."
So your health suddenly changed in 2007.
Yes.
And how did that affect the businesses at the same time that you were running, the four companies that you were working with? Were you able to maintain those even with the physical issues?
Yes. I managed to make it from there to the end of 2015. But the only reason that I was able to make it till 2015 was the most amazing group of people I've had the luxury to work with in my career. I just had an amazing, I don't know how else to put it. Good Lord bless me with people that when I got sick and things began changing, they just stepped up. Individually, there'd be a couple people from each of the businesses, but particularly the office manager. She just wasn't going to let it fizzle away on me. So, yeah, this part's always kind of hard to talk about because they were such amazing people.
For those people that maybe haven't been serial entrepreneurs, you actually had a management office that you went to every day that actually handled all these businesses, right?
Well, the brokerage was stayed in Milwaukee. The research firm was actually in Dallas, and the company in India the offices were in New Delhi.
So you weren't commuting to all of those places. You were sitting in one place mostly and doing the work, and so having an amazing office manager, for example, was a great way to keep it all together.
Absolutely. And at one point, I ended up in the hospital for 8 weeks, and I got back to work, and one of our clients called us up to ask a question, and she sent him through to me, and he said, well, kind of stammered, and eventually said, the reason I'm calling is I really want to ask Sylvia a question. And then I realized at that point they didn't need me any longer. You know, that they had taken this and taken it to a new level and put in their excitement and their ideas.
Well, if we're talking entrepreneurship, the sign of a great entrepreneur, or maybe that when an entrepreneur becomes a manager, the great sign of a great entrepreneur and manager is that the business can run without them. You've evolved it to a point where, frankly, I never have, but I think my hat's off to you that you were able to build them so that they could run without you. That actually shows some real value. Can we get back on the ham radio track? How did you come into ham radio then and finally get your license?
Well, as I said, in 2007, they found I had this kind of strange immune system issue. It's very rare. There's only about 60,000 people globally that have it. And so at that time, the physician said, the good news is we're going to be able to handle this. You can't play soccer, you can't race cars, you can't do any of this stuff that you might want to do, but we can handle it. So the bad news is something else is coming. That's just the way this tends to work. And so in 2009, they found out I had cirrhosis of the liver as a result of this immune system issue. And then as the time went by, comes to 2015, and the attorney and the doctor told me, you're out of business. You just can't continue at this point. Falling asleep in meetings and not remembering things was not going to be a positive.
Which was the side effect of the cirrhosis of the liver.
Right. and the beginnings of something called HE, which is hepatic encephalopathy. So I had it very mildly, but nonetheless it affected. So at that point, they said, you got to hang it up. It's done. And I started looking forward, and I started thinking to myself, I've always been somebody that needs to have something to look forward to. I had big long-range retirement plans, but those weren't going to happen anymore. That was obvious. At that point, I was, 52 when I got diagnosed, and all those years later, I finally had to quit working, and I'm thinking, okay. A doctor shared with me a great thought, and that was, I'm sorry, but you have to plan for the worst, but we're going to hope and drive for the best. And I thought, okay, I'm going to drive for the best. I'm all about that. I told him I was going to beat this whole cirrhosis thing, and he kind of laughed and chuckled, to himself, because nobody ever has. And in any event, 2015 comes rolling around, and the lawyer and doctor tell me to hang it up, and I'm thinking, what I'm going to do in the future that I can really have a passion about, that keeps me involved with working with people, that would give me opportunities to, if I can't travel a lot, if I'm stuck in the hospital a lot, whatever I got coming towards me, because at that point, Mayo Clinic had said, you're not going to get out of 2020, 2021, maybe 2022 without a transplant. So I thought, well, okay, it's 2016, January 1st. And I started thinking about it. And I thought back to my childhood, something that I already kind of knew something about, but hadn't done but loved. And radio. It was the obvious. So I got involved in ham radio and found myself in a community of the most amazing people.
So let's go back a little bit so we don't forget a detail here. You decide you want to go back into ham radio. You're in your wife's hometown.
Yeah.
How did you find that next step? Did you call the local amateur radio club? What did you do to get yourself plugged back in?
Interestingly enough, I ran into somebody who I'd known as. He started talking about it. I started talking about it. He was telling me about a number of the clubs in town, that if I'm really serious about this, I should probably get a hold of them first, even before I bought whatever kind of rig I was going to purchase. So I started listening to podcasts like this. I started reading, and I got a whole rack full of books back here, and I probably don't understand 90% of what's in them, but it nonetheless kind of kept the fire going. And I talked to my wife, and I was talking to her, and at about the same time, I bought one of those C crane radios.
Right.
That had the short wave bands, and then you had VHF on there.
Don't they also have like a hand crank? Is that the same brand?
Yep.
To charge it in case you're out in the field?
That's one of their versions. They're an amazing little company. I started listening at night to one of our local repeaters, and they had a lot of activity. And it seemed like really nice people, and it seemed like they were doing a lot of really good stuff. And one of the things I kept thinking about is, if I'm going to get excited about something, if I'm going to go forward in something, I really need something where no matter the health, I can still operate. It may only be in the shack because maybe I can't go places and do things. It may be from the hospital bed, which we've tried a few times. It hasn't turned out entirely positive in the hospital, but things like that. But as I listened to the repeaters and the club, and then I found a couple others in the area, and the ham radio is huge in Milwaukee to this day, and Wisconsin in general. And so there are a number of repeaters, half dozen I could probably name, and a really busy community. And that's what got me excited about it. I talked to people who had health issues, and in fact, one guy came back to me one night via email and said, hey, I'd love to get together someday and just have breakfast. Well, it turns out somehow he'd heard about my whole liver thing going on, and he had already had a liver transplant. And so we kind of became fast friends and spent every Wednesday morning having breakfast, talking more and more and more about ham radio. So eventually said, if I'm going to do this, I'm going all the way, and I got to do it now because I don't know what my future lends. So I went out and got my tech and my general and my extra all in 1 year.
What year was that?
I was 2016, the beginning.
What was your first call sign?
It's the same as it is now, KD9FPC. I wanted to go to my dad's call as a vanity, and I could have, unfortunately, or fortunately, the day, in fact, the FAA sent me my letter that, that call sign was available. And the reason my dad had it, it was his vanity, was primarily because it was great for Morse code. So he's an OCW guy from way back.
Right.
He had graduated from the Merchant Marine Academy and had to know Morse code to get out. I've never changed it, but that day that I was going to, my kids gave me a birthday gift, which was a personalized KD9FPC license plate and a hat with my call sign on it. So I didn't feel like I could, well, that's great, guys. Thanks very much. But my call sign is now.
It sounds to me like that was meant to be.
Yeah, it was. It was.
And now this mid-show break. You can keep the QSO Today podcast commercial and sponsor-free by becoming a listener sponsor yourself. For $10 a month or save 20% at $100 per year, you can become a listener sponsor. I am now recording the QSO Today podcast as video interviews that are available only as a benefit to listener sponsors through our QSO Today community website. As I develop the sponsorship tier, I will add bonus content for listener sponsors. Listener sponsors, not donors, are automatically members of the new QSO Today Academy. That includes the upcoming QSO Today Academy event on September 9th and 10th, 2023. I am building the Academy website to include access to our Sequel.io networking lounges all of the time, even after the event, and Academy resources including over 400 previous Expo presentations with Q&A. And additional helpful ham radio educational resources. The benefit of listener sponsorship as an alternative to commercial sponsorship is that commercial sponsors influence the content and comments in the podcast. Listener sponsorship allows a greater degree of freedom to discuss any ham radio subject without commercial consequence. I have eliminated all commercials in the QSO Today podcast from episode 445, with the exception of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, as I think that this is a serious asset to a well-rounded ham radio education. I am not using Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon, but my own system for managing the community that could form out of the podcast. I direct you to the sponsorship section of the show notes pages beginning with the episode 444, where I list all of the contributors to the podcast since 2014, including sponsors, donors, and hams who have paid for transcriptions. Our funding model is now value for value, where you trade with me your time, talent, or treasure that you think values the benefit of the QSO Today podcast to you. If sponsorship is not your interest, then you can make any size donation to the podcast by clicking on the donation button on the QSO Today podcast website at qsotoday.com. There is a slider that you can use to adjust the amount of your donation. If you want to make your donation monthly, click on the recurring donation box. It is the recurring donations and the listener sponsorships that keep the lights burning here. There was one anonymous monthly sponsor and one anonymous donor. We appreciate their contributions without mentioning them by name. We also appreciate all of those of you who are buying our QSO Today Academy event ticket for September. You make a difference. Finally, you don't have to contribute anything to listen to the QSO Today podcast. You can use my Amazon affiliate link before shopping at Amazon by clicking on it on the right side of the show notes page. This will signal Amazon to send us a small percentage of what you purchase. This is the most painless way to ensure that the QSO Today project will be here next week. I want to thank everyone who has contributed and will contribute to my effort to create this oral history of amateur radio since 2014. It will eventually all be in the public domain for hams in the future to enjoy. Be sure to become a listener sponsor or make a donation today. And now we return to our QSO Today. How important were Elmers to you in that first year, getting yourself the first license, getting on the air, joining the repeater, whatever it was you did? How important were your Elmers there?
Critical. I think one of the best things, now that I'm on this end of the spectrum, I think one of the best things anybody can do in this hobby is to just help another one come along. And that was certainly true of mine. I didn't have an Elmer, I had Elmers. And they were all so fantastic in all their different ways. And I would not have been able to get up as quickly and as well, I'm sure, as I have on the radio, simply because they were terrific. They helped me every step of the way.
You get the new license. What was the first step in terms of getting yourself on the air? What did you do?
When I got my tech, I by the way, I'm a no-coder, just for anybody who's listening. But I have since learned code. But I had gone out and purchased my little Kenwood TV71. It's just a little dual bander, UHF, VHF, and that and a Samlex power supply. I put a magnetic antenna, vehicle antenna, up on a filing cabinet. I just stuck it to the top of the filing cabinet, started operating with my tech on my little Kenwood radio.
And working the repeaters that you'd been listening to on the Sea Crane radio?
Right.
Oh, very interesting.
Eventually ended up running some nets.
Well, it sounds to me like you should be the ambassador for older people entering amateur radio now that they've got retirement time or sick leave time or something like that. It sounds to me like ham radio is the right ointment for the problems that you were having.
Well, it's no doubt true that, health-wise, it could have worked out a lot better. It still worked out fabulous. I'm not naive. I know what I've got. I know what it's doing. And I've been so blessed with just an incredible medical. But, the big thing is that even on the worst of days, you can go pick up that microphone or get your CW key out or FT8 or whatever it is you do and be in a completely different world in a matter of minutes. And that's been a terrific thing. Because, and another saying I heard, when you're in transplant, they require you to see a shrink, the psychiatrist, and because they want to make sure that one, you keep yourself screwed together up to the transplant, and two, that you can handle the transplant after you've had it. I always had a rule for me. She always gave me a rule. You can get depressed and you can have the greatest pity party you want to have every day if you want, but it's only going to last 30 minutes. And then you're going to turn and you're going to do something that you want, and that will make it impossible for you to stay in that place. Because if you let pity and all of that take over and miss the beauty that is ham radio and getting out across the world and all the things that you can do. And Eric, you said it best when we were talking. Ham radio isn't a hobby, it's a passion. It's a way of life. And it comes with it many gifts as long as you're willing to get to that point where it is a passion. It's not just a hobby. I got hobby and then I got ham radio. It's a very different thing. So it's been amazing. To be able to get on a radio, a rig, sitting here, I use a Kenwood TS590 SG. I can get across the world. It creates its own community. It becomes, it's the original global community. Everybody's big into their global community things these days, it seems.
So you mentioned that you have the TS590, and I think we'll keep touching on the value of ham radio in terms of creating an opportunity to distract yourself from the issues of the day, for example. What kind of antenna do you have on the roof with that TS90, 590, and what is it that you like to operate? What are your favorite operating modes now? Because it sounds to me like you're on HF, not just on the local repeater.
Right. I do spend a lot of time on HF, and the antenna I've got is a 43-footer. It's a vertical, made by a company named 05, Chicago. It's a wonderful, wonderful antenna. It doesn't require guying, which is important. I live in your classic neighborhood small lot, reasonably small lot. I think the whole lot's 60 by 150. So if you put a ranch house down on that, there's just very little yard left. I couldn't do anything I had to guy. I really wanted the tower. I shopped all over for it. But then I figured, went out and calculated it, and I'd have had to guy two sides of it out in the street. So I didn't think that was a good plan. I mean, literally, I had to put them in the ground out in the street. And I started out life when I went to HF with a dipole. Then I went center fed, and I tried off center, and then the tree rats ate the line. So down came the dipole, and I thought, this is nuts. And I was getting to the point then in health where being outside and doing big antenna projects wasn't going to work out very well. So a group of ham friends came over, and we erected that vertical. There's no guy wires. It sits. I've got a big steel rod in the ground in about 5 feet deep worth of concrete, and so you could just mount it to that. So it actually stands at about 45 feet. Being in the black hole of ham radio here in the upper Midwest, doing a lot of DX work is somewhat difficult with it. However, I've done it, and I've got 48 of the 50 states done. If I can get somebody in Alaska and Hawaii to talk to, I'll be all set.
Well, a 43-foot vertical usually implies that there's an antenna tuner at the bottom of it. Is that what you have?
It is. It's a unit that came with the antenna. It came as an entire unit. And then in the shack, I have a MFJ Versa Tuner 5 that I use whenever I want to try to do something nuts. This thing, I think, could tune a bed spring, but nobody'd hear you.
Yeah, that's true. What's your favorite operating mode then on that HF? Do you operate everything, or do you have something that you're doing now that you really like to do?
Single sideband is a blast, but so is CW. And I learned CW in 2017, and I had become fairly proficient at it. I wouldn't pat myself on the back and say I was anything amazing. 15 words a minute, maybe 20 when I was having a great day. When I had the transplant, there were some complications to it involving some damage to the brainstem and the back of the brain. And then I was 5 weeks in ICU, sedated the entire time, and ended up with a total of about 2.5 months in the hospital. And then my CW was gone. I couldn't remember any of it. I couldn't remember a lot of things. And so that's what got me into memory and researching the topic and interviewing people and things like that. But as you say, we'll save that for the QSO.
We can hint at it, and that is you're doing a presentation at the QSO Today Academy on September 9th and 10th. And that presentation is based on ham memory. So we're not talking about silicon or anything like that. We're talking about the amateur radio operator's memory that sits between two ears.
Correct.
And you've developed some techniques for improving memory, especially after a catastrophic illness.
Well, it doesn't even take, I'd have to consider them catastrophic, but in terms of how they change life. But it could be someone who had a stroke. Oftentimes their memory is affected. It could be somebody that had a traumatic brain injury. Their memory is often affected. It can be the result of organic issues with aging.
Or a medication backfiring or something like that?
Absolutely. And in fact, what I did is I put together a group of guys that I still meet with a couple times a week. And one person in particular who I talk to almost every day, who, by the way, is in the UK. When I get to my global, I try to stay global. But in any event, the people within this group are people who have had health challenges, maybe heart attack, maybe a stroke, maybe the traumatic brain injury, whatever. We just talked about those. And I started realizing, and this is what really drove me into it, is I started realizing that memory isn't an issue just to me. Memory is an issue to anyone, whether it's just memory as it goes with normal aging or memory as it goes with some type of illness or injury. And there are ways to fight back. And there are ways, and I'm not talking about taking supplements or anything like that. There are just ways that you can keep your memory working.
Or restore it, in your case.
Yeah, will it be as good as you were when you were 30? No, but you'll be a lot happier. But it also says to people, you don't have to let age be the factor to determine what you're doing in the ham world. Now, maybe you're not going out and climbing the tower, but you can certainly be in the shack and talking with people. But the thing that really drove me was CW. I had completely lost it, and with it went my confidence in any CW that I could scrape up initially. And I kept going to class. I belonged to Long Island CW, SKCC, FIST, and all the rest. And I was going to classes. About 15 minutes later, it was gone. So then something hit me, and this one I won't talk about now, but something hit me as to how this has to work. I started looking deeply into it, spent literally hundreds of hours up to my eyeballs in literature studies, things like that, some interviews with people, and learning the basics of how we learn and what we can do at any point in life to be able to make it better. And along the way, I also learned, in addition to the memory issues, the learning. And so for the academy, what we'll be doing is also talking about a new ham or an older ham that's looking to upgrade their license, maybe just get from general to extra, or tech to general, or for that matter, they have no license now. But it's bigger than all that, because these are the same techniques you can use day to day, hour by hour, as you go around, as you travel about, and you're going to run into things that you really do want to remember.
Well, I believe that there's probably a number of us that listen to the QSO Today podcast, including myself. I'm very interested in watching your presentation. I can feel at times that my short-term memory is disappearing. I don't think it's disappearing any faster than my neighbors who are the same age is disappearing. It's just, God willing, I don't have some kind of big issue. But I can see that memorizing things is difficult, or more difficult than it was when I was much younger. So I'm looking forward to your presentation, and I hope that the listeners who are coming to the QSO Today Academy in September will also be sure to check it out and engage with you live at the Academy. And even if they can't engage with you live, it'll be on instant on demand for their benefit. Tom, I wanted to talk a little bit about, I noticed on your QRZ page, you have quite an assortment of radios. But one of the things that you said that you're doing is that you're actually restoring some old rigs. How are you getting involved in old rigs? What's driving that interest?
A Mohawk, a Marauder, I guess what they like. Some people will call the Triple Indian from Heathkit. Because my dad had the Heathkit, as I mentioned earlier, I always had an affinity for that oddly blue-colored aqua, whatever you want to call it, deal. Cabinets. I bought an old Heathkit setup, one piece at a time. I've been working on that. Now, I've got one more that needs to be recapped, then I'm going to have 4. But I like things that glow in the dark. Nothing better in a small shack to warm it up than to fire up the Heathkit.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
With all the tubes, they make plenty of heat.
So really it's the nostalgia of recreating your father's old station?
Pretty much. I couldn't find a military surplus receiver, but I married the transmitter with its receiver.
You can ask the QSO Today listeners whether they have I'm assuming that the military receiver might be like an ARC-V or something like a BC, 315 or something like that?
Yeah, it was a BC. All I know for sure is that you could throw a grenade at the thing, you weren't going to hurt it.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. I know we have a number of rig restorers and people that have old rigs. They might in their warehouse have something and maybe they'll contact you and let you know about it. I saw that you mentioned that you have a homebrew variac for varying the voltage of your AC mains to your new projects. How did you construct a homebrew variac? I think that the commercial variacs, there's a wiper that goes across the coil windings in order to bring that voltage up. What did you end up doing?
Well, I ended up finding that the wiper and winding just all by themselves at a ham. And everybody always said, you need to get a variac. You need to have a variac. And I agreed. Well, let's put this. Is there any time, anywhere that a ham can't figure out a way to spend money? So I got this thing at home, and I'm looking at this, and I'm thinking, okay, now I got to turn this into a variac, where I'm going to lose a lot of respect with my fellow hammers. And Eric, I think I'm not heavily technical or electronics. The good Lord put me. I have decided on this earth to serve people, not. Yeah, and so I haven't learned as much as I really should know. But I thought, well, this is a good place to start as any. So after I got done building, I think probably my 15th little crystal radio, I got this variac, and so I made a steel plate that the whole thing could mount to, got one of the big black knobs, got all that taken care of, and made a case for it, and then wired it all up. I was so amazed at the end that it worked that I thought, I'm never opening the case again.
I think that's great. I think that's where it begins. I've mentioned it probably in the last episode, I have a new student, a 9-year-old grandson of a friend of mine who is so excited about ham radio and electronics and the Morse code. It's so infectious. I can't help spending an hour preparing for the hour that I spend with him every week. You know, the first thing I did with him was to take his he brought himself a portable VOM, and the first thing I did was blow all the breakers in the house to show him. I said, well, this was really to show you how dangerous the electric mains can be, but of course I made a mistake, and then I have on my workbench, I've got a 100-watt light bulb that's in series with an AC plug, which is probably what I should have done first to find out if I had the cables on his little VOM. So I can appreciate having something that works and not opening it ever again because it just works and I don't want to screw it up. So I appreciate that story very much. I'm curious because it seems to me that I said earlier that you're an ambassador for someone who enters the hobby late, but you become very passionate about it and it seems to make a difference. Based on your experience, is there something that we could do better as a community to bring in people like you into the hobby so that you can be more successful than you've been?
In my case, I can't think of an experience that would. Even, well, as I said, it's a bit of a joke, but even when I got sick, we tried to hook up, connect me to first VHF and then later maybe even HF in the hospital room, but found out that wasn't. First of all, the hospital doesn't like RF coming out of their rooms that they don't anticipate, and which is something I should have thought of. But and the fact that the walls are all concrete and the windows are leaded in order to keep UV rays out. So needless to say, it didn't work. I put my pickup truck on the top floor of the parking ramp at the hospital, or a friend did. He brought it over and parked it, put a whip antenna in it. On it and a magnetic for VHF, and then we used the computer link between that and home and to the hospital, and I made one successful VHF contact, and that was it. But if I would think I'd like to get back to that. But one of the things that the ham community can and did do for me is to simply. If I meet somebody like myself, And I think they would really enjoy it. And everybody knows I'm a hammer because I can't shut up. But the thing that got me involved in the clubs I did and the things that I've done was simply getting invited to a club breakfast or to come out for a day of field day or whatever the case may be, to someone who doesn't have a license but is just kind of wondering. So if I understand your question correctly, I think we as a community would do ourselves great service if we would reach out to the non-ham community and make sure, one, they know what we do and how much value that has. And secondly, that, hey, here's a group of people who'd like to have you join us, but why don't you first just come see what we're all about? And I have no doubt that unless they're just having an amazingly bad day at breakfast, the community will take it from there, and me. So if somebody is a late bloomer, such as me, just being asked, that seems to be that simple. It's people to people. You bring in one or two people in the course of a year or two, and you've replaced yourself once and maybe twice.
I think that's so wise, Tom. I know that from my own experience that people who are asked for help, it's easy to get an Elmer. The hardest part about getting an Elmer is asking someone to be an Elmer, right?
Right.
The hardest part about getting new members to your club is asking people to join or to come to a meeting or to come to breakfast, because the yes usually follows the ask, but we don't ask enough. And I'm 100% believer in what you're saying. The other thing that I might mention is that, and this is just an aside, there's a large number of business entities, large corporate business entities in the world that want our frequencies for their use. And since we're the rangers of probably the largest RF worldwide national park, international park on the planet, then we actually need to let people know outside of our ham radio community who we are, that we're still here, that as the wardens of this park, we know how to take care of it, and our special expertise that we develop as a result of being the wardens of this park, if you understand the euphemism I'm using, that it has a lot of value to society and to the communities that we live in, the places that we serve. So I'm 100% behind you that we should be asking non-hams, even if they've never shown an interest in ham radio, to come to something, because I think we'd be surprised that the answer would often be yes.
It is. The other thing, when you talk about asking somebody, I learned this a long time ago, is that if someone asks me for help and I don't, and I give it, who got the real blessing? It was me. And if you don't ask for help, if you don't ask questions, you're making it such that people that have some experience and are happy to share, they miss the blessing of helping. And it's important.
We're doing them a favor, aren't we? When we're asking for help to someone who could be our Elmer, for example, we're actually doing them a favor. We're allowing them to feel significant beyond the day-to-day significance that they may or may not already feel.
Right.
I think that's so powerful.
And I think, too, what you did talk about is something that, whether it's the ARRL or whomever, you have to stay on the business side of ham. You can't just ignore it and have fun on your radio and talk to others, because you're right. There are plenty of people who would take our RF in a heartbeat. But when I think about it, it makes me mad because they're in it purely for a profit motive. It's not to do anything worthwhile. So here you're at this park, as you put it, a great example, and we're the wardens, and it's sort of like, well, okay, I'll let you have that trunk over there, or I'll let you have that trunk over there. You can't let them over the fence, because once it happens, it's not going to stop. And I'm really concerned for ham radio to the extent that if we don't stay relevant and we aren't out there telling our stories, even to neighbors, about, hey, you see that big antenna sticking up in my yard. Obviously, you probably wondered, it's ham radio, but at the same time, also, do you realize that, the government's trying to pull away our ability to use that and to provide things such as support for races and marathons, and in times of natural disasters, things of that nature. And we're losing, or could lose that, unless we keep the door to the park closed.
I think you're right. I think you've got it. What is exciting you the most about ham radio? When you think about ham radio, what kind of makes you look forward to tomorrow?
Want to get to learn something new every day. Oh, and just the only time I get upset with ham radio, and I can't even call it upset because I just blow it off. But every once in a while, you run into the person on the radio. If I read the manual one more time, but in any event, we have to also be a community that accepts questions. Nobody knows where anybody else is in their journey on the radio. So if we're not willing to ask a question and risk sounding stupid, which I do on a regular basis, the hobby part of it starts to kick in, and you're just reading manuals and turning knobs and things. I think we really do need, as a community, to support each other. And there, I've said it and got that off my chest. It's the only negative I have about radio is once in a while you get some person who clearly knows more than you do and is clearly on the rampage to prove it. And you end up walking away feeling kind of dumb for having asked the question. I think we got to take on every question from every ham and non-ham gladly and use as an opportunity to teach something we do know. So there. I've been on my soapbox. I'm down off it.
I'm glad you said it. The truth is, I've never read a ham radio manual. I mean, who can? But if you know how to Google, now. I mean, you can get most of your questions answered. And I agree with you. There are lids and kids and space cadets in every field, including ham radio. But you know what? It depends on where you ask the question. If you hang on there long enough, you'll get somebody that says, well, I've actually thought about your question. So therefore, here's the thoughtful answer that you deserve. So I think those people are out there too. I like looking at the Facebook groups where people are asking questions. And of course, you get the guy that says, well, read the manual, stupid. Or, well, there's a whole long paragraph full of PhD electronic engineering lingo that you don't understand. But there's somebody that finally answers the question, and I think that's good. So we do, as a group, have everybody in our ranks, good and bad.
Yep. But fortunately, the bad are less than 1%. Of that, I'm convinced.
I think you're right. I think that the hobby attracts exceptional people. That would be my theory.
I would agree with that.
What advice would you give to newer returning hams to the hobby?
I would say just get in it. And if you need to or want to, you get your tech license, get yourself a little VHF, UHF mobile unit and make it a home base if you want. But just get talking, get on the air. It's really all that simple because once you're there, you're addicted. But that can be a place to start. The other thing is that people who are at all interested, in my experience, have been people who were exposed to it at some time as a kid. You mentioned I think you said a 9-year-old?
Yeah, I have a 9-year-old student right now.
Life may be such that he has to pull away from radio because of work, of family responsibility, of whatever. But he'll be the easiest guy in the world to talk to get him back into it when the time comes that he's able to really get involved.
I agree with you. The seed will be planted.
Yeah. So I think to the extent that we can go out there and work with youngsters and at least expose them to things, they're curious naturally, and they're a blank slate in terms of what kind of things they find interesting. But it'll always come back around. So I think, first of all, if you meet somebody who's had any experience in the past, you can ask them about it. And when you see the little glow show up, you go, hey, why don't you get back into it? Let's give it a shot. And, I'll help you. We can get this going, and you can just stick a toe in the water for not much money, if you wish. And yeah, you have to do a little studying. There's a license involved, but heck, it's no big shit.
And getting an Elmer makes even that VHF, UHF $25 portable well worth the money, and it gets you on the air.
Absolutely.
The Elmer part was the key part.
Yeah, well, people don't kind of bump into ham radio anymore like maybe once they used to, when it was the predominant way of communicating. You know, the day that they ran in Korea, because you go back to World War II, everything was radio. And, you know, in Korea, they figured out, well, we'll connect them by wire since we can't do line of sight. So somebody had to run the wire out. And that changed radio. And suddenly it became something, the glorious part started to go in cells, and not speaking to the choir here, but I think what it requires is every one of us go out and invite a couple people into the world of ham, whether they know it or not. And I think once they get there, it's done deal. Now, well, what we did here was we got working alongside the STEM program, science, technology, engineering, and math program. We actually started a ham club at the high school by just simply going in, offering to go in as a presenter at one of the STEM classes, and out of that came about half a dozen people, young people, who again they may fall away from it as they get into their careers and families and things, but you can bet they're coming back.
Did you have to find somebody on staff there that would sponsor a ham club on the campus? And did you find another ham who happened to be at the school?
You first want to connect with STEM, with the program itself, whoever the director, not the vice principal or the principal, because they can come up with a million reasons why you can't. So you want to connect right at the teaching level with a STEM teacher. And at that point, then say, hey, you know, I'm a ham. How about I come in someday and just talk about ham radio? And they'll be like all over that because they love to have presenters. Then you can talk to them afterwards and say, it seemed like some of the kids were really pretty interested. You know, you want to get a little ham club connected to the STEM program here at the school possibly. And by the way, schools make absolutely great places to put up antennas because they're always out in the open. And you can go, you know, you can start at 200 feet.
Did your group rely on the ARRL Teachers Institute for any curriculum materials or anything like that could be applied to the STEM program at this high school?
We did use some ARRL materials, but for the most part, handing a kid a wad full of paperwork to study or exercises to do and things like that. Yeah, it's great, I guess, as a reference, but the chances that they're going to rush right home and read it and study it.
I was more thinking in terms of demonstrations of technology that were written for STEM so that you don't get too far off the track, but you're kind of in the STEM area.
Yeah, we did use some of those. The other thing we did, and we probably should have used more, but silly us, we did a lot of it ourselves because I think you said earlier, for every hour that we were helping these kids, it took an hour or two just to get ready because we were all writing the so-called curriculum from scratch. You know, what the kids love to do is just get on the radio. And we made sure we were getting them on the radio around times like when the Scouts on the air, things like that. And it was a year-round deal. They didn't get to go home for summer from their ham radios because we also put each person in charge of a variety of jobs in ham, and then we rotated who was doing what and when, so they kind of got a decent picture of it all.
Equipment for the club was donated by the community, the ham community, or did they actually have a budget to buy equipment?
No, you start talking about dipping into the school district's budget, you're not going place. We found out that what we had to do was, and again, this kind of comes back to it's a good time when hammers buy all kinds of equipment they don't need, because we were able to put together, this guy's transceiver and this one's antenna, and and they were happy to have it be used, and so I mean, I know a guy's got 50 radio sets in his basement.
All of us have equipment that we're not using, maybe in various shapes of performance and non-performance, but if we had to whip it up for a high school ham radio club, I think we certainly could. I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast, Tom. I thought this was a great conversation. It was very interesting. I think that you have an interesting perspective for a person who has maybe a catastrophic life change, but even it doesn't have to be catastrophic. It could be just retiring and all of a sudden finding that your life is filled with a bunch of different priorities and perhaps the schedule is suddenly altered. And I think that perspective with regard to ham radio means that ham radio is a great next step for people in transition. So with that, I want to thank you so much and wish you 73, and thank you for coming on the QSO Today podcast.
7-3, Art. Keep up all the great work, and thanks for having me.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Tom. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in Kilo Delta 9, Frank Papa Charlie, KD9FPC in the search box at the top of the page. Tickets are on sale now on the QSO Today Academy website at qsotodayhamexpo.com. Tickets are $15 and will give you access to the QSO Today Academy event on September 9th and 10th, 2023, and the 30-day period following. Please get your ticket today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing on the subscribe buttons on the show notes page. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages. Your value for value support is recognized on the QSO Today podcast and in the weekly show notes. Use our Amazon link when you shop on Amazon. Clicking on this link before you enter Amazon will allow Amazon to pay us a small commission on what you purchase. This is a very painless way to support the QSO Today podcast. QSO Today is syndicated on every podcast platform, including Spotify and the iTunes Store. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.